Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this session. We're going to discuss publishing in the American Journal of International Law. I'm Kurt Bradley. I'm one of the co-editors-in-chief of the journal, and I'm joined today by my co-editor-in-chief, Larry Helfer. We also have our administrative editor, Megan Kelly, here with us, and also a representative from Cambridge University Press, which publishes the journal, Rebecca O'Rourke. We really appreciate you attending the session. We did this last year and we got great questions, and we're hoping to leave enough time today after we say a few words to get any questions that might be on your minds this year. We were going to briefly touch on three topics and then open it up for questions. One, we thought it might be useful to give you a brief overview of just how the publication process works for the American Journal. It's not always clear to the outside world exactly what happens with papers and how they get processed. Second, we'll say a few things about what Larry and I tend to look for, and probably many of our board members look for in selecting articles to be published in the journal. Larry and I have been the co-editors-in-chief for about 2.5 years, so we've now had a chance to see a lot of manuscripts, and we can give you at least our insights about what seems to work well. And then finally, kind of the title of the session, and hopefully will be helpful to you, is just some tips that kind of stem from this in our minds that you might want to take it into account when preparing submissions for the journal. And it may be that some of these tips would be useful just generally in preparing law review submissions, particularly for any of you who might be junior scholars relatively early in your scholarly careers. So just a little bit about the process of the submissions process for the journal. We get nowadays about 400 submissions a year, and we only are able to publish around 8 or so lead articles a year, maybe a little bit more, and then maybe a few shorter essays and current development essays. So you could just tell from the numbers, it of course is difficult to get published in the journal. However, we do try to publish a wide array of authors on a wide array of topics, and even when we're not able to publish a paper, ultimately we try to give feedback, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in a minute, to authors who submit to us. So once a paper does come in, Larry and I actually have a team of students who help us, submission editor students, who look over the submissions and give us a brief memo about each paper. And they highlight some of what they think might be the strengths and limitations in the papers. And then we actually independently review these papers ourselves and think about whether they should go to our board of editors. And that's kind of the really big step at that stage of the process. Most of the submissions are not going to make it to the next stage, just because it's a big task to then have our board start reading these articles and giving us feedback on them. If we do reject a manuscript at this stage, as I've indicated, we do try to write back to the authors, something that a lot of law reviews I think are not able to do, but we do try to do, and give a little bit of feedback based on our reading of the paper about what you might want to think about as you keep working on it for publication. If we do decide to send a paper to board review, we typically ask about 4 members of our board of editors, and you can see who they are if you go online, to look at the manuscript, and then often 1 or 2 outside experts beyond the board as well, particularly if the manuscript's on a specialized topic. This is all double-blind. The board editors don't know the author doesn't know who's reviewing the manuscript, and we keep it anonymous. And we try to do this pretty quickly for a peer-reviewed journal. We try to get this, our board members to review manuscripts in about 2 weeks, which is quite fast for a peer journal. Once we get the reviews back, we then, of course, make a decision about whether to proceed. And we either accept the manuscript, we decide not to take it, or often we decide to ask authors to revise it and resubmit the manuscript. And I would say, in fact, in probably a majority or maybe even most of the cases where we publish an article, in the 2.5 years we've been the editors-in-chief, we typically first ask for a revision, usually because we have a lot of comments from our board members that we want to make sure are adequately addressed. And so then there's maybe a revised version. We try to give the author plenty of time to do that. And then we do make a decision after we get the revised version, often asking the board members who looked at it the first time to take another look to make sure that the authors address their concerns. Under our rules, this is something that not everybody knows. We actually cannot take a manuscript and publish it unless at least 2 of our board members affirmatively endorse publication. And so it does have to be a back and forth process with the board. Now, the good news, if you make it this far to the board process, at least under our tenure, we've done statistics on this internally, and it looks like about half of the time, 50% of the manuscripts that go to the board ultimately do get accepted for publication. So that's a big step, as I indicated earlier. And then there's more process, of course. Once we do take a manuscript and it's all been revised, Larry and I actually routinely do a line edit as well with our own thoughts late in the process to try to further refine the manuscript. And then there's professional editing process that goes on top of that. So that's a pretty elaborate process compared to some journals, but it's actually not a particularly lengthy one. Part of that is we speed up these board reviews and try to get them pretty quickly. The other thing that helps us get these manuscripts out pretty efficiently is that we, since taking over as EICs, has had a goal, and we've managed to meet it, of actually publishing the journal on time in every issue. That means the October issue comes out in October, January comes out in January, which means once we can process the manuscripts, they do come out pretty quickly in a reliable way. And we've heard from a lot of authors that they really appreciate knowing that the paper will come out pretty expeditiously, which isn't always true sometimes with some other journals. So that's basically an overview. I don't know, Larry, if you wanted to add anything just to that brief description.
I think you've covered, Kurt, thanks, all of the main things. I will say just in general that when we get to, although, as Kurt mentioned, most of the submissions that are reviewed by the board will have considerable edits, whether they are through a revise and resubmit process, which is probably most common, or a conditional acceptance process. There's still quite a bit of work for authors to do. And two things I'll just add. One is that we often will have 5, 6, 7, even as many as 10 or 11 single-space pages of comments and suggestions from anonymously from members of the board and from outside experts in the field that we also identify. What we try to do when those comments come in are two things. So first, we will identify from those comments, because we've been both in on the other side of receiving that sort of commentary, and it's quite heart-stopping when you open that and you see that kind of commentary. But we try to give guidance for the authors. We'll say, okay, here are the 6 or 7 or 8 things that we really think you must do if you're going to revise the manuscript to meet publication standards for the journal. And the second thing is that we really do make ourselves available. So we've had a number of instances, especially with younger scholars. We've really made an effort to reach out to younger scholars and scholars from outside the United States, where we've said, okay, we know this is going to take maybe an extra step in the process. And so we try to work with authors, not in the details of the reorganization, but sometimes we've had follow-up conversations with authors who have, as they've gotten into the revision process, have decided that they could use some additional guidance about how to proceed. So it's fairly hands-on. It is intense, but we think it really produces a good product in the end. That's all, I think.
Thanks, Larry. So now I thought I might say a few words about what over the last 2.5 years we found that we tend to look for as the manuscripts come in, things that tend to be aligned with the papers that end up getting published. If this is maybe helpful to you as you think about submitting in the future. So one of the things as editors-in-chief we're thinking about is, of course, subject matter. The broad subject, we have a broad notion of that for the journal. Just about anything connecting with international issues of general interest fits with the journal's coverage, I think. And also U.S. foreign relations law is something that has long been covered in the journal, and we do publish on that as well. We tend not to publish papers that are primarily about national laws of other countries, more internal. They might be hugely important topics, but they're not quite the public international law topics that we tend to look for. Or purely comparative national law papers tend to usually fall outside of the normal coverage of the general interest international law journal. But other than that, it's a very broad coverage. We do aim for diversity of papers in a bunch of respects. So I was just looking this morning to go back. In the last 2.5 years, we've published on cyber operations, transnational climate change, reform of the investment law system, self-reporting under human rights treaties, how corporations enforce international human rights law, how international law as a whole may be changing as a result of authoritarian regimes becoming more involved in the project. That's just some of the examples, mainly just to show you we're really looking for a wide variety of topics, both in terms of generality and in terms of subject. It does mean it's worth looking before submitting to the journal. What have we been covering the last few years? If we've just done in the last couple of years a big article on cyber warfare or something, probably we're not going to return to that immediately because we don't have that many slots and we're trying to have diversity of coverage. We also know Larry also cares very much about this. We really aim for methodological diversity. That is, we think scholarship can be valuable in many different approaches. So if you look in the last couple, I looked again, we've got purely doctrinal pieces about, let's say, the ICJ's case law. We've got empirical pieces that are big data sets. We've got history pieces about things like the history of the Geneva Conventions. We've got philosophical pieces about the nature of international criminal law, economic analysis, critical theory, and others. And just give you an example that we are also looking for a broad range of approaches to international law as well as a broad range of topics. We're also looking, and we say this in our tips, I think, for the authors that you probably have for this session, it's also online, which we're trying to think of whether the paper is likely to be of lasting significance. So a lot of important things can be said about a particular moment in time, but they may be overtaken if there's a new case or a new change in a treaty regime 6 months or a year down the line. That tends to be of less interest for the American Journal. It may work better for a blog or for other publications that have a shorter turnaround, but we're really looking for something that even in 5 years will still be something that scholars will be citing, relying on, thinking about, debating. And so that does certainly affect some of our decisions in this area. And kind of related to that, is it the type of topic or claim or theory that's likely to generate interest and connection with other scholars? Is it likely to start a conversation that will be ongoing with others who are interested in that area or related areas? So maybe something's important about one kind of doctrinal point, but it may not be the kind of thing that's generating a lot of additional dialogue beyond it. We're more likely to look for pieces that become kind of fonts of new conversations. And if you look at some of the articles we published, I think you'll see those are the kinds of pieces that tend to generate lots of feedback and responses and maybe additional work. Those are just a couple of things. I'm sure, Larry, you probably have something to add to that.
Yeah, I'll just add a couple of points. Thanks, Kurt. One is this, we sometimes get pieces that are focusing on very topical, timely disputes, whether before a particular tribunal or controversies in the diplomatic sphere or within international organizations. And the flip side, I guess, of wanting a piece to have lasting power is, to echo something Kurt said, we don't want it to be eclipsed in the near future if the activity or dispute or event is still ongoing. So sometimes there'll be a desire, you want to say something, there's something really happening, and you want to get the word out quickly. Those sometimes are not the best for, say, a longer research article, because it may well be that even by the time we were to publish that, the events will have overtaken things. On the other hand, we have made a real effort to, in addition to publishing the longer research articles, and maybe it's worth noting here, we tend to like research articles. Where target as a cap is about 25,000 words, including footnotes. But some of the excellent articles we've published have been between, say, 15 and 22,000. So that's probably a sweet spot. But we also publish current developments and essays. And with respect to current developments in particular, we've published a number of those, and we'll be publishing others that are somewhere in the 8 to 11,000 word range. And those are more conducive to talking about something that's recent, where you don't have to attempt to cover an entire field or try to explain what a particular development or a set of related developments mean for the future of that area of international law. Rather, you will be able to explain what the development is and offer some thoughts and insights about the significance of that development in a way that we hope would allow you then to develop those ideas further as the issue matures. So particularly for scholars who haven't yet published in the journal or are not sure if they have a longer research article that fits, an essay or a current development that's shorter can also be a very effective way to try to talk about recent activities and also allow you to, if you will, plant your flag for future scholarship.
Thanks.
Back to you.
I thought I would just give a few tips, and this will just be some of the things we put in our document you can look at that's also online, and hopefully will generate some additional questions. I know there are questions already, so I don't want to say too much more because I want to make sure we have plenty of time to address the questions that are coming in. But a few tips as you're thinking about maybe submitting eventually as you're writing manuscripts. I think a lot of these tips are actually useful just in general, even without regard to AJIL. And some of them will seem obvious. If you've been writing scholarship, they'll probably seem too obvious. But sometimes I think people who are fairly new to this, it's not as obvious. One is just have a clear thesis. And so what do I mean by that? The introduction needs to tell the reader exactly what the paper is doing. Don't let them have to discover it, because people are busy and they really want to know why they should keep reading. And more importantly, they want to know what you think you're doing. Why is this an important topic? What are you doing that hasn't been done in prior work or related work? Are you disagreeing with other work? Are you adding to it? Are you filling in a gap that hasn't been addressed before? The reader should know that very early in the paper. And if you're making a normative claim, a policy prescription claim, you ought to be very, very clear in the beginning what you're going to say. Because then everything the reader gets to afterwards, they'll think about in the context of what they know you're trying to do. Makes for a much more successful article. And interestingly, I advise a lot of younger scholars, even at Duke or other places, one of my pieces of advice is the last thing you ever finish in a paper is the beginning. You might think that's the opposite. You start with that and you write your way to the end, but no, you only figure out the beginning of your paper when you've actually finished everything else, because the beginning is the roadmap to what you figured out. But that takes your whole process before you do figure it out. And certainly that's true for me. I probably rewrite the introductions to my papers at least 10 times before I submit, because I'm continually changing my mind about exactly what I'm doing based on what I'm thinking about and learning in the rest of the paper. And so I would encourage you to be really clear about your thesis and what you're doing in the paper, and that helps us evaluate the paper better when we get them. Related to that is, think about how so scholarship is a conversation of some sort. You know, it's a nice thing in a world that we live in, so fraught with so many difficulties. The scholarly community in the broad sense, internationally, domestically, is talking to each other, hopefully respectfully. And that means you're coming into some conversation that's already been going on of some sort. Now, maybe you're adding in a piece of the conversation that nobody's had before. Maybe you're disagreeing with something that's been talked about. Maybe you're trying to shed new light on a conversation that people have already had. But you're coming in to a dialogue. And it ought to be clear to the reader how you're coming in to the dialogue. It ought to be clear to you as well. And that means some indication of what other scholarship is out there or not, and how you're connecting to it. And that's one of the things we actually asked our submission editors, our students, to look for. How is this connecting in to other scholarly conversations? And that ought to be clear to you when you're writing at some point as well. Explain why it's important. It must be interesting to you. You wouldn't have spent all this time working on it. It must be exciting to you. I hope you probably are passionate about the topic. It's important to convey that passion to the reader. There's something really significant. It might just be theoretically, but I don't mean just, but it might be theoretically important, the way we change the way we think about something. It might be that you have a big policy idea about climate change or something that you really hope would be implemented. But there should be something significant about the project, and the reader it should be evident to us. As maybe it's about the future of the WTO. That's very topical. But maybe it's something very historic and long-lasting. Things can be important in many, many different ways. A couple of other thoughts that we see a lot in manuscripts that we'd like to help people improve on. Scholarship is not a brief. Briefs are great for going to court, just filing the ICJ, filing in domestic systems, but scholarship is not that. It is all ideally trying to add to a conversation and shed new light on the conversation and persuade people who, by the way, might not be easily persuaded. That means acknowledging limits in what you can claim and what you can know. In fact, any important topic, the idea that you've solved everything is very unlikely. Now, it would certainly be true of anything I've written. The best we can do is try to make some headway. And that means acknowledging where there are weaknesses and where there are limits on what we can figure out. That actually makes you more credible anyway, and it's just also more helpful. And related to that is deal with counter arguments. So we often advise authors we see, you make a good case, but there's some important issues that are occurring to us you just haven't dealt with that might be problems on the other side here. And you just need to give in fact, a best case, best faith description of the other side if you can. And if you can overcome that, it's much stronger paper. And final point, and I have others I could get into, but stylistically, we have noticed that the more you can try to make it accessible to generalist readers, the better. This is a general interest international law journal. We publish on a huge array of topics. We want readers around the world of all sorts to be interested in what comes out each time in the green volume or online. And that means even if people in your specialty would fully understand every reference you're making, it may not be good enough for a general interest journal. So just to give you one of my little pet peeves, a reader cannot hold a lot of acronyms in their head when they're reading. They just can't. It just slows you down. Wait, so that's that acronym and this one, and then I'm just not reading very well anymore. So even though that's probably the way we often talk to our specialist friends and colleagues, it's probably not good for just trying to communicate with the world. And just think about that in terms of your organization, in terms of the terms of art you use, and certainly things like acronyms, so that you can get more readers and more impact as the journal is read by a lot of different people. So those are a few things that I could highlight. I'm sure there are others, and I bet Larry would have some others as well.
I'll just, thanks, Kurt. I'll just bring in 2 points, and then we've got a bunch of questions, so we'll turn to those. One question we sometimes get from authors who are considering submitting papers is if they're working on a project that has multiple parts to it or is quite extensive. So this sometimes comes up, for example, in the context of whether we would publish a chapter from a PhD dissertation that covers a large amount of ground on a particular subject area, or if there's a multi-year research grant that's going to generate a number of different articles over time. How does that fit with your submission? So I think what we would say is generally it's challenging to divide, say, a book-length manuscript and simply say, well, I'm only going to talk about these other issues here. I know you want to probably also know about a related set of issues, but that's not what this paper is about. That's probably not going to work for us because we and the reviewers will want to know probably about that field overall. So what you might do for something like that is to rethink about the project as if you can identify what's most interesting, what's most salient, what's most of interest to a broad cross-section of readers, and then reframe what you've already written as, say, a manuscript chapter, a chapter in a manuscript for that kind of audience. So that may mean that you might publish the first article in a series with us, or potentially an article that at the end of, say, many years of research, you step back and take stock on what the research has added to the field overall. So it's very hard to step into the middle of a conversation in your own work. And that's, I think, one thing to keep in mind. That doesn't mean, I want to be very clear, that we have particular substantive points of view that we think are better than others, or particular theories or methodological approaches. We try to be as open-minded as we can and try to put ourselves in the shoes of the authors to say, okay, well, if I were employing this methodology to try to make this particular point, here are the things I would try to do, and here are the potential objections that I would expect to encounter. And then we would try to help the author to figure out what she or he would do in terms of constructing the strongest argument possible. So we don't have personally to agree with a particular substantive claim, or do we necessarily have to say, oh, we really only want empirical work or only work of a particular genre or about a particular topic. We try to be as open on that as we can. Okay, a few comments, if we can turn to questions. Kurt, are you ready for that?
I'm ready.
Yeah, okay. So let's see. Just go back through the list to see what we have. Maybe I'll try to just take a few smaller ones first and let some additional questions come in. One of the early ones we received, we also, for those of you who don't know, have sections of the journal, which are, we've been talking about articles, essays, and current developments primarily, but the journal also has a book review section. It has an international decisions section. It has the contemporary practice of the United States in international law. And of course, it has the online companion AJIL Unbound. So one question relates to whether the journal ever commissions case notes or book reviews in advance. And the answer to that question is we give a lot of deference to the heads of the particular sections to decide what cases, international decisions that apply international law, or what books to review. Having said that, I do know, because I forward them on to both of those section heads, that we have authors who approach those section heads either directly or through one of us or through Megan Kelly to say, well, I really like to write about a case note on this particular case. And then the section head will make a determination based on the kinds of cases we published in the past and how the importance of the case itself, or what are, in the case of book reviews, what sorts of reviews are there that we've had recently, what are the mix of different topics and so forth, and work with the author on whether it makes sense to publish that or not. So the short answer is, in terms of commissioning, yes, but it tends to be a kind of collaborative process. Both the editors reach out to potential authors, and authors reach out to us. So that was one topic. I don't know, Kurt, do you need to say much more?
To emphasize one point you said, which is, what I remember when I was pretty much starting out, the way I first connected myself to AJIL was by doing a couple book review essays. Yeah, that's a great way. And they do try very hard to get a lot of more junior scholars involved in that writing. And that also is true of Unbound. It's a little bit different process there because that's a symposium-oriented publication online. But they make huge efforts, and we encourage them to do that, to include a lot of more junior scholars. And often that's the first time those people write in any way for AJIL. And of course, hopefully, eventually, there'll be other kinds of writings over the years for AJIL, hopefully, ultimately full-length articles as well. So those are really good points for the junior scholars, in addition to others.
Yeah. Why don't we bite off one of the harder questions? Sure. And this one that I think is a really good question, and it's one, the answer to which maybe changes over time. Are there topics or areas of law that you wish you were receiving, where you wish you were receiving more submissions? And conversely, are there topics that are overrepresented in your submissions?
I mean, the funny thing, as Larry knows, the funny thing about this topic is I don't think we could have predicted our answer to this question when we first became editor-in-chief. It's interesting. It's just, what's funny is there are moments in time when there are a lot of people kind of writing about a certain thing, and we get a lot of those. So just as an example, I think it was a surprise to us how many articles we got the first 2 years on international investment law. Of course, it's an important topic, and there are reform efforts underway. But we've got a tremendous amount of submissions now. We have published at least several articles since taking over as EICs in that field because we had so many submissions and so many of them were good. But there's a limit, obviously, because it is a general interest journal, and that probably, because of our need for diversity of content, raises the barrier a bit for subsequent submissions because we do need to look for other topics as well. So that's one where we might have gotten a little bit saturated, I think, in the first couple of years. Larry, what do you think in terms of where we're not getting enough?
Yeah, that's where I was thinking about it. I will say one thing. We are shortly, next month, going to publish in the July issue a piece on the transformation of international tax. And that's highly unusual. And for those of you, of course, many of you are international legal scholars or international lawyers. Tax in the domestic realm and in the international realm tends to be a specialized sphere. But what attracted us to this piece is that it really was trying to explain how those specialist concepts intersected with things like the negotiation and design of treaties, the relationship of international tax to international economic law more broadly. So that was unusual. I don't expect we'll get very many of those. In terms of other areas,
we expected, for example, to get a lot of manuscripts on international human rights, and I think we do. We get a lot, and we publish some of those. We've published about issues about international organizations and human rights and about reporting on human rights. So we expected that, and those are interesting papers. We have been getting, I think, a fair amount on international trade, and that's maybe not surprising given all the difficulties with the WTO and all the trade sanctions and the like in the last 3 years. We get a lot on cyber, again, not surprising because of all the efforts to come up with codes of conduct and norms and the difficulties of knowing what the law is. We get a lot, I think, a fair amount on laws of war.
Maybe one area a little less, I guess, is international environmental law. We haven't had quite as much as I might have expected. We certainly have we published a big piece on climate change litigation in the Global South not long ago, which was an empirical and a theoretical piece. So that's an area, though, I expect that we could see a little bit more over time. There have been a number of initiatives relating to outer space, interestingly, and that's an area that I think we might see more of going forward. But I would say overall, we're reasonably well in balance. So it's a great question, and please ask it again in 6 months and give you a different answer if you didn't like the one we just gave you. Okay, sort of a related question, if I can find it. Does the journal cover private international law topics or only public international law? So I would say that's always a question about what that definition means. So the area of private international law that we tend to cover quite a bit is not surprisingly going to be things like some of the Hague conventions. We had a current development on the new Hague Convention on the enforcement of foreign judgments. We have published some things on international arbitration and its connection to international investment law. What we haven't really done is, to the extent private international law means conflict of laws across countries or borders, we tend not to publish on that topic as such, unless we can link it to something else. So we probably, I think it's fair to say, do more in public international law than we do in private international law. But to the extent that comment means international business topics or topics relating to investment, no, those are clearly within the heartland of what we do. Let's see. So a few other questions have come in. Right. So as in the same vein, transnational legal theory. I think that's a great question too. I think we have tried to be, we like papers to relate to the same sorts of things that broadly stated international legal scholars and international lawyers would be interested in. So transnational legal theory would certainly fit within that rubric. We published not a few years ago, there was an agora or a symposium on comparative international law, which is a kind of interesting hybrid between some comparative law methodologies applied to international law. So I think transnational legal theory would be useful. I think that we would, yeah, I don't know that I need to go much further than that. Kurt, did you want to add anything on that?
No, I agree with that. We have done some, say, transnational litigation kinds of topics where countries are borrowing from each other on climate change litigation and theories, connecting, of course, to international law materials, but still looking at a transnational kind of legal litigation process, at least. So that, I think that's certainly of interest to our readers and would be within our coverage.
Great. A few other questions that I think would be useful. I'm just scrolling down through here to see what would be useful. A couple of technical questions, maybe we'll take that on now. Does AJIL follow the style of US law reviews in terms of editing, writing, citation, or is it more general? So first of all, I would say on the AJIL website that Cambridge University Press makes available, we have a very detailed style sheet. So you can see precisely the kinds of citations that we're looking for. I would say on the whole, we are a little more relaxed than American law reviews, student-run law reviews are in terms of citation style and having things have to conform to the Blue Book. We deviate from the Blue Book in a number of respects. One of the nice things about having the detailed production process that we do, and I just saw another question pop up, does AJIL have its own internal team of copy editors? I'm about team necessarily, but we do have a full-time professional copy editor, and we also have professional site checkers. So in that sense, we are unusual as a peer-reviewed journal. And while we certainly ask authors to try to conform as much as they can to the style sheet, the piece will be looked at every line, every footnote, and will be edited across the board. That's true for all the content in the journal. So I think from that perspective, there's a little more leeway. I would say overall, so the question, this would also be relevant to the question, we tend to publish pieces that they should be appropriately footnoted, but we generally don't follow the convention, although fewer American law reviews do now, of having substantive arguments that are kind of tangents below the line in the footnotes. And we also tend not to favor things like string citations. So give us the best citation on a particular point, and you don't need to give us everything else. And if you think a point is worth making, either make it in the text or maybe save it for another piece. So we like our pieces to be a little bit more streamlined and where the authorities are supporting the arguments, but you don't need to constantly be looking up and down in order to be able to get the full gist of it.
Yeah. And one small thing I'll just add to that, this is just a suggestion. It's not a requirement. You might find true for other journals as well. If I were submitting to us, I would go through some recent AJIL articles and just kind of have my article generally look like it's in that general style. We do have a style pamphlet online, and if you could follow some of that, it'd be wonderful. You don't have to worry about being perfect about citations and things. We can fix some of that. But the more it roughly matches our style, it's just less likely to be distracting because it will already kind of look like what we're going to need to do to the paper if it goes through the production process. And I think that's true for other journals. I try to do that, just roughly have the paper look in the way the journal tends to prefer. And you could just get that from looking through a couple of recent AJIL articles, I think.
Great.
We have some more here.
Yeah, we do. So one other question, and I think this is a good one too. Although current PhD or even JD candidates are not sophisticated enough to produce qualified submissions, will AJIL consider them equally? A couple of points on that. We have actually received some excellent submissions from from recent, from candidates in PhD programs, from individuals who were basically just finishing up their PhD, and also some JD students as well. So we do consider them. I think the chances for current JD students would be challenging. I'd much rather think you'd be better off, at least as a first attempt, trying a book review or a current development or an international decision as a starter. But we do consider them, and we have sent them to board review, particularly for the younger PhD candidates or recent PhDs. And some of them have done very well, and we've published them. We've actually published more junior authors, I would say, than I had expected quite early on in their careers. And related to that, there was a question about where did it go? The first stage of review being blind. If by the first stage you mean the stage where the editors-in-chief determine whether something goes to board review, that can't really be entirely blind. So once we decide whether a manuscript goes to board review, then it's double blind. And similarly, if we do ask the reviewers to look at a revised manuscript, it remains the double blind. But we don't, at our stage, and this is, I believe, standard practice across peer-reviewed journals, the editors of the journal do need access to the information to figure out where things stand. In terms of, let's see.
Some questions about kind of timing, I think, Larry.
Yes,
so just going back. I think there's a question about if you wanted to get in a particular issue, assuming it all worked out. I think
so deadlines for research articles for the October and January editions. So I would say we are now publishing, thanks to Cambridge University Press and its team, we're publishing on time. We have now for almost 2 years, I would say. And we do tend to try to mix up the content of the different issues. So we receive manuscripts on a rolling basis. And so now where we are is looking to fill, and I'll say a little bit more about that, the October and January issues. We have a number of pieces that are in the pipeline for both of those issues. As we've announced previously, we also have submissions that we expect to be, we have quite a few coming in, but for a July 1st deadline for a symposium or agora on the COVID pandemic and the international legal order. And that may, if things work out with that, that will take up a good chunk of the room for articles and essays in the October issue. So I guess my biggest point is I wouldn't worry so much about which issue you would be going in, and rather just work to get your piece to the best stage you think it should be in before you submit it. And since we often will have to move content around, both in terms of diversity of subject matter, and if we have something like a symposium, or we have a particularly large set of materials from the contemporary practice of the United States, those are all reasons why we don't give a guarantee to authors that they go on any particular issue, but we try to get them in print as quickly as we can.
I saw that.
Yes, Megan, please.
Just along the lines of publishing in a certain issue, we do have a accepted manuscript feature on our Cambridge Core website. So even though your manuscript may be in the pipeline to appear in the October or January issue, once that manuscript is accepted, it will show up online in its pre-production format. And so you'll be able to share that with your fellow colleagues, and while your actual manuscript is being worked on before it appears in the journal issue.
Great. And there's a question that I think, Rebecca, you might be better to answer, which is about open access. So the question, we have a couple of questions on Unbound. I haven't forgotten them, and I'll come back to them. But does AJIL do open access issues, or must I submit to AJIL Unbound for my submission to be open access? Before I turn over to Rebecca, I will just say, to clarify things, so AJIL Unbound is 100% open access. The journal itself is, the current practice is that it is partially open access. So the contemporary practice of the United States and international decisions as of about a year ago are fully open access. The rest of the journal has not been, unless we've had a Unbound symposium around a lead article, in which case it has been, that lead article has been open access for a period of time. But we've had a number of, we're in the process of transitioning, I should say, to a new policy. And Rebecca, maybe you want to say a word or two about that?
Yeah, I mean, what I would say about it is, so even though we haven't officially been open access, we do open up content for a variety of reasons. Like Larry said, if there's an Unbound symposium, then we will open up a paper for a month. The other thing we do is if a paper becomes particularly topical, then we might open it up on a temporary basis as well. What I would say is if any of you are published authors or are going to be published authors in the journal, do get in touch and let us know if you're doing some serious self-promotion of your journal. You might be doing a blog piece, you might have received some popular media attention. Let us know, because we can open up the article to coincide with that. But as Larry said, the journal is going hybrid open access from 2021. So that will mean that any individual author can pay an APC to make their article open access, or it may be the case that your institution is part of a deal that will make your piece open access as well. So it's coming soon, January 2021.
Great. We have one question about the length of AJIL's lead articles being an outlier compared to other journals. Could you talk more about the history and purposes of this? So I think it is certainly true compared to some of the other leading international journals. So we publish 4 issues a year, which is less than some of the other journals. That's one thing. And there has been a history of publishing longer research articles. I think both Kurt's view and my view is that we are trying to expand the content that appears in the journal. And so we would like to publish at least 2 lead articles. We've even had 3 in one issue or 2 issues. And to do that, we also are encouraging authors not to send us their magnum opus. That is, we've sometimes said, this is an interesting part of your argument, but it's really kind of tangential. So we'd encourage you to cut that down. And so again, we make clear we prefer articles in the say 18 to 25,000 word range. But, given that, I think we are trying to make more room as much as we can to do that. So I think we are very conscious that this is a journal that is 113 years old. And so there's a lot of tradition behind it, but we've worked very hard to bring it with Cambridge's help, into the 21st century.
And one other point about that is we have authors, of course, submitting to us all over the world, which is great. And it's really been nice to see our ability to publish people, certainly many people outside the US. But we also, of course, get a lot of submissions from US authors as well. And some of those, of course, are designed, the submissions, for the US law review market, which might itself be kind of singular in terms of student-edited reviews. Those tend to be usually pretty long submissions. The kind of tradition in the US law reviews for lead articles is pretty long. And some of those are great articles. And so we certainly would like the journal to be one possible placement for some of those really good international law pieces when we're competing with those US journals. But I think our bottom line view is the length of the piece depends on the piece, and it can be very successful being pretty short. Some topics require more treatment. We like to think of ourselves as very flexible we don't have a set notion of that. If it gets super long, we will push back, and we have with some authors. we thought the paper was really good, but we just thought it was just too long. And even with very established authors, we've been able to talk to them about condensing it to make it shorter, more concise. But there have been shorter pieces, and that we hope that we'll get even more of those shorter pieces if they work. That is, if you can make the arc of the argument work in a shorter space, that's terrific, and we'd be happy to look at those.
Great. A couple of other questions. I think maybe we'll just move over. There were a couple questions about AJIL Unbound. And how does one submit to AJIL Unbound? Are topics advertised in advance? So what tends to happen is there's a separate team on AJIL Unbound now, headed by Melissa Durkee, and she will often receives proposals for particular symposia. And that's, so if you're interested in that and you went to the AJIL website, you'll be able to see a way for submitting a suggestion for a symposium. And the best suggestions are probably, say, a page or two of description with explaining why the topic is important, what it would cover, and ideally proposing some authors who would be part of that symposium. Each AJIL Unbound symposium ranges between, Kurt, if I get this right, 4 and 7 essays, including a framing essay by the editors of that particular symposium. And so you were certainly, the way you would engage in that is if you had an idea for a symposium, to send it through the website to the Unbound editors. The editors will then also often work with the proposers to broaden the perspectives that are in the symposium. So they will often suggest the names of other authors who might participate, or those that the proposer suggests are unavailable. So it's a process of trying to put together a comprehensive issue, but we certainly welcome proposals for symposium issues.
Yes, in fact, the Unbound team generates some of the proposals internally for sure, but I'm just speculating, but probably at least half or more are actually based on outside suggestions that come to them. And as Larry mentioned, if you do that, do expect that it's a dialogue, because they really do, as a team, and with me and Larry, they need to develop the proposal so it works well and has a good diverse set of authors and the topic is framed well. But they benefit hugely from getting suggestions from people about symposia. They publish about once a month, as Larry said, about 4 to 7 essays. They're only up to 3,000 words, which makes them easy to read, and that means they can cover it they can get them done pretty quickly and process pretty quickly. And that means also, because they're pretty quick, they can really get on some timely topics that would be a bit harder for the print journal to grab onto. And they continue to do that. Now, so I think one of the questions was, what about even more of a kind of a, short-term content, like on some of the AJIL Talk or other blogs and things like that? We have thought about that, and probably will continue to think about that space. One of the things we like about Unbound is it really does kind of occupy a space that wasn't occupied otherwise, which was somewhere between the full-length scholarly articles and the more kind of quick blog kind of thinking, both of which are really valuable. But these are essays in Unbound that we still expect to be cited several years hence, and that are short pieces of scholarship, but can be done quickly with some footnoting and a little bit more scholarly depth than you would tend to get in the more of the quicker blog posts. So it kind of has that niche to it. Obviously, a trade-off is it doesn't necessarily cover some of the more day-to-day. It's just not built for that. But our board, we've talked about this with our board, and I think the sense so far is that it's doing what it does quite well. And there would be a lot of issues about whether to expand that or not. Every year we look at the statistics on authors for Unbound. It is just amazing the geographic distribution around the world of those authors. The racial and gender diversity and all other kinds of diversity are really quite spectacular, usually with Unbound. So it's really become a forum for doing a lot of things we would have more difficulty doing in a journal that only has a short number of lead articles. We can expand our connections to Unbound really in all those different ways. So I think it's doing that well, but with pieces that are still, I would say, pieces of scholarship And so for now, that's probably going to be the way that continues, I think.
Yeah. The only thing I'll just add to that is that we do draw connections between the print journal and Unbound in a number of ways. So if you were to go to the PDF version of Unbound, each of those essays, when you print it out or when you view it online as a PDF, looks precisely the way it does in the journal. And so we do that deliberately because what you will see looks the same. We treat it the same way. There's also copy editing and site checking for the symposia in Unbound. And we will choose generally one of the lead articles in each of the 4 issues of the journal to serve as the seeds for a symposium around that particular topic. So that's often one way of broadening the conversation to include other scholars with different perspectives. And it's also very attractive, I think, for the authors who do want that, because they're able to have a conversation in which their piece has served as a kind of template for a broader set of conversations. And the Unbound pieces are very highly cited as well. So they often will be cited. I've seen them cited on particular topics because they can be narrower. They can often really focus in on things that might not fit well within the print journal, but nevertheless, they become quite authoritative. I think that covers most of what we wanted to say, and I think most of the questions. Kurt, do you want to say anything by way of wrapping up?
No, I think we've had a great set of questions. I would emphasize that Larry and I try to be very accessible as editors-in-chief. You should not hesitate if you have additional questions to reach out to us or to Megan or Rebecca if you have questions about any of this. Some of you know us, some of you don't, but there are probably things that will occur to you about the journal that haven't been covered here because there are lots of other topics. So feel free to reach out to us. See, there might be a last-minute question as I was talking. I see. Lead articles are usually published by more senior scholars. I think the answer is no. Interesting. There's some senior scholars, of course. It is such a mix. I think Larry got at this earlier. Maybe that's a surprise to us. We've been so pleasantly surprised at the high-quality scholarship we've been getting from junior scholars. And you may know that American Society has a prize for scholarship in the journal by younger authors. And there have been some years in the past where there haven't been a lot of submissions by junior scholars. That has changed, and we had many nominees, for example, this last cycle up for the award, and we expect that to continue. There have been at least a couple of our authors the last couple of years that'll say things to us like, can you hold up publication because I want to use this paper for my job talk. I'm applying to a law professor job. And see, these are people really starting out. And it's exciting for us because that's the beginning of their career a lot of the times. And it's great that they're doing that in the journal. So it's good for us, at least. It's certainly going to be a mix. You should not avoid submitting to us just because you're not a senior scholar. In fact, if you just look through the last couple of years, you'll see such a nice range. So I really am glad somebody asked that question. And if you have, like I was saying, if you have additional questions for either of us, feel free to reach out to us. It would obviously be in an ideal world. I'm hoping for the day we all are when I can talk to you in person. That will come, I promise you, someday. Hopefully the next major AJIL meeting. And we like to do these in person, but at least this technology has allowed us to bring us together a little bit and answer some of these really good questions during the last hour. Larry?
No, that's it. So thank you very much to AJIL for hosting this, to Rebecca O'Rourke and Megan Kelly and Justine Stefanelli and the tech crew behind this for putting everything together. And as Kurt said, we hope to see you in person at the next mid-year or annual meeting. Take care.